Chapter 2.
Yesterday afternoon, when I left Thrushcross Grange, it was misty and cold. I had wanted to stay by the fire in my study, but when I went in, I found no fire there. The maid was cleaning the fireplace, so I set out and walked 4 miles through the mud to Wuthering Heights. When I got to Heathcliff's door, a few feathery snowflakes were falling. No one answered my knock. Though I knocked loudly, the only result was that the dogs inside began to howl. Then Joseph put his head out of the barn window. He was an old man with a sour expression.
"What do you want?"
he shouted.
"The master's in the fields with the sheep. You will have to go there if you want to speak to him."
"Is there no one inside to open the door?" I shouted back.
"No one but the mistress, and she would not open the door if you knocked all night."
I was surprised to hear there was a mistress at Wuthering Heights. "Can't you tell her who I am, Joseph?"
"No,"
he replied, and his head vanished. The snow was falling thickly by this time. I tried to open the door, but it did not move. Then a young man with a pitchfork on his shoulder appeared in the yard. He beckoned to me, and I followed him around the house to another door. Finally, I reached the huge, warm, cheerful sitting room. There was an immense fire in the fireplace. The table was laid for the evening meal, and near the table sat the mistress. I bowed and waited, thinking she would ask me to sit down, but she just looked at me in silence. "Rough weather?" I remarked. She did not reply. I stared at her, and she at me. I felt very uncomfortable.
"Sit down,"
said the young man gruffly.
"He'll be in soon."
The female hunting dog, whose name was Juno, moved the tip of her tail as if to greet me. "A beautiful animal," I said, trying once more to engage the mistress in conversation. "Will you give away the puppies, Mrs. Heathcliff, or keep them?"
"They are not mine,"
she replied in a voice even colder than Heathcliff's. "Ah, well," I decided to try the weather again. "It's very cold out this evening."
"You should have stayed at home."
She was a slender and very young woman. Her figure and face were lovely. Her golden curls hung loose on her shoulders, and her eyes would have been irresistible had their expression been pleasant. Fortunately for my susceptible heart, their expression was a combination of scorn and desperation that seemed most unnatural in a beautiful young woman. She stood and reached up to take a jar of tea from one of the shelves. I rose to get it for her, but she snapped at me.
"I don't want your help. I can get it myself."
"I beg your pardon,"
"Were you asked to tea?"
she demanded, putting a spoonful of tea in the pot. "I would like a cup," I answered.
"Were you asked?"
she repeated. "No," I said, smiling. "You are the proper person to ask me." She stopped preparing the tea and sat down in her chair again, clearly angry. The young man came and stood in front of the fire, glancing at me from time to time with a stern look, as if I were his worst enemy. At first I had thought he was a servant, but now I was not so sure. His dress and speech were both rough, not at all like those of Mr. and Mrs. Heathcliff. His thick brown hair was wild and messy, and he was unshaven. His hands were brown like those of a common labourer, yet there was something proud and free about him. I felt relieved when Heathcliff came in. "You see, I have come to visit you again, as I promised," I said cheerfully. "I won't be able to leave for half an hour because of this snow. I hope you don't mind me staying that long."
"Half an hour?"
he said, shaking the snow from his clothes.
"The snow will not stop in half an hour. Why do you go out walking in a snowstorm? You could get lost. Even people who know the moors well sometimes get lost in snowy weather.
Perhaps one of your servants could show me the way back to Thrushcross Grange.
Certainly not.
Well, then, I must try to find the way alone. The shabby young man turned to the mistress and said,
Are you going to make the tea?
Is he having tea with us?
she asked Heathcliff, pointing at me.
Get it ready, will you?
Was the answer, spoken so savagely that I started. The tone in which the words were said revealed a genuine bad nature. I no longer thought that Heathcliff was a fine fellow.
Now, sir,
He said to me,
bring your chair forward.
and we all sat down to tea, including the rustic youth. We ate in silence. I thought it was my presence that made them so grim and taciturn. Surely they were not like that all the time. So I tried to make cheerful conversation to alleviate the mood. Many people would think a life of such seclusion could not be a happy one, Mr. Heathcliff, but I am sure that here, surrounded by your family, with your amiable lady—
My amiable lady?
he interrupted, with an almost diabolical sneer on his face.
Where is my amiable lady?
I mean, Mrs. Heathcliff, your wife.
Do you think that her spirit is with me in Wuthering Heights, even though her body is gone?
I realized that I had made a mistake, and I tried to correct it. I should have seen that there was too great a difference of age between them. He was about 40. She looked no more than 17. At 40, a man does not think that a girl would marry him for love. That dream is the comfort of our old age. I suddenly thought that the clown beside me, who was drinking his tea out of a bowl and eating with unwashed hands, might be her husband. He might be Heathcliff Junior. What a pity! She must have married him out of ignorance that better men existed. I thought I must be careful not to make her regret her choice. The last reflection may seem conceited. It was not. The young man seemed to me almost repulsive. I knew, through experience, that I was quite attractive.
Mrs. Heathcliff is my daughter-in-law,
said Heathcliff. He looked at her with a peculiar expression on his face. He seemed to hate her. Ah, certainly. I see now. You are the happy husband of the amiable lady, I said, turning to the young man. This was worse than before. The youth blushed a deep red and clenched his fist as though he were about to hit me.
Neither of us is married to her. Her husband is dead,
said Heathcliff.
She was married to my son.
And this young man is—
Certainly not my son.
Heathcliff smiled.
My name is Hareton Earnshaw,
growled the other.
And you must treat it with respect.
I've shown no disrespect, was my reply. I began to feel very out of place in this family circle. The dismal atmosphere outweighed the physical comforts around me, and I thought I would not come again. When tea was over, I went to the window to examine the weather. It was not a pleasant sight. Darkness was falling, and the wind was full of swirling snow. I don't think I will be able to get home without a guide, I said.
Hareton, bring those sheep into the barn,
said Heathcliff. What shall I do? I asked with rising irritation. I turned to look at Heathcliff, but I found that the only other people in the room were Joseph and Mrs. Heathcliff. Joseph was feeding the dogs. Mrs. Heathcliff was entertaining herself by burning matches in the fire.
How can you stand there idle?
Said Joseph to Mrs. Heathcliff.
When everyone else is working. But you are nothing, and it's no use talking. You'll never improve. You'll go to the devil just like your mother.
I thought for a moment that he was talking to me, and I stepped forward intending to kick the old rascal. But I stopped when I heard Mrs. Heathcliff's reply.
You old hypocrite! Aren't you afraid that the devil will come and take you away for speaking his name? You leave me alone, or I'll ask him to do it.
She took a long, dark book from a shelf.
I am learning witchcraft, Joseph, the black art. Soon I will get rid of all of you by black magic. The red cow didn't die by chance, and your rheumatism is no accident.
Oh, wicked, wicked!
cried the old man, hurrying out of the room.
May the Lord save us from evil!
Mrs. Heathcliff, I said when he was gone, is there no one in the house who would guide me back to Thrushcross Grange?
Nobody.
She said. Then I will have to stay here. Heathcliff appeared in the doorway, looking grim.
I hope this will be a lesson to you to take no more walks in the snow. You say you will have to stay here. Well, then you must share a bed with Hareton or Joseph. I have no guest rooms.
I can sleep in a chair in this room, I replied.
I don't want a stranger in my house while I'm sleeping,
said Heathcliff. With this insult, my patience was at an end. I pushed past him and went out into the yard, just as Hareton was coming in. It was so dark I could not see the gate.
I'll go with him as far as the park,
said Hareton to Heathcliff.
You'll go with him to hell,
cried Heathcliff.
Who will look after the horses if you go?
A man's life is more important,
said Mrs. Heathcliff, more kindly than I had expected.
I won't save his life for you,
said Hareton.
If you care about him, you had better be quiet.
Well, if he dies, I hope his ghost will haunt you. And I hope that Mr. Heathcliff never finds another tenant and that Thrushcross Grange goes to ruin.
Listen, she's cursing them,
muttered Joseph. He was milking the cows by the light of a lantern. I took the lantern and quickly went out through the gate, saying that I would send it back tomorrow.
Master! Master! He's stealing the lantern!
cried Joseph.
Let the dogs go after him!
2 hairy monsters leapt at my throat. They knocked me down, and the light was extinguished. My nose began to bleed. I heard Hareton and Heathcliff laughing. Trembling with rage and humiliation, I cursed them. My threats of retaliation sounded like King Lear's, but still Heathcliff laughed. Finally, the big, strong woman who had saved me from the dogs on my first visit came out to see what was happening. Her name is Zillah.
Well, Mr. Earnshaw,
She cried.
are you going to murder the gentleman in our own backyard? Come, sir, you're bleeding. I'll take care of you.
She poured a pint of icy water down my neck to stop the bleeding. Then Heathcliff told her to give me a glass of brandy and prepare a bed for me.
Chapter 3.
As she led me upstairs to the room she had chosen for me, Zillah told me to be very quiet and hide the candle, because her master never let anyone stay in that room. I asked the reason, but she said she did not know. She had only lived in the house a year or 2, she said. So many strange things went on in the house that she no longer asked about them. When I was alone in the room, I looked around. The only furniture was a chair, a wardrobe, and a large oak case with windows in it, like a carriage. I looked inside it and found a bed and, above the bed, a window. On the windowsill was a pile of books. I opened the door of the oak case and climbed in with my candle. When I had shut the door behind me, I felt safe from Heathcliff or anyone else. As I placed my candle on the windowsill, I noticed that it was covered with writing, scratched in the paint. It was a name repeated in all kinds of letters, large and small. Catherine Earnshaw, sometimes changing to Catherine Heathcliff or Catherine Linton. Feeling sleepy, I leaned my head against the window and read and reread the names until my eyes closed. But then I saw white letters like ghosts in the dark, and the air swarmed with Catherines. I woke up and realized that my candle was starting to burn the cover of one of the books. I opened the book. It was a Bible. The name Catherine Earnshaw was written on the flyleaf with a date of 25 years ago. I looked at all the other books one by one. Catherine's library was well chosen and well used, but the books had not been used in the usual way. She had written a diary in the margins of the books. Every bit of blank space left by the printer was filled with Catherine's childish handwriting. On one page I found, to my delight, an excellent caricature of Joseph. I began to feel a keen interest for the unknown Catherine, and so read a little of her diary.
An awful Sunday. I wish my father were back again. Hindley is being horrible to Heathcliff. H and I are going to rebel. We began this evening. Joseph had made us listen while he gave a sermon 3 hours long. When we came down, Hindley said, "What? Have you finished already?" He had been enjoying himself by the fire, kissing Francis and talking nonsense. H and I were going to play, but Joseph said, "Shame on you! Your father was only buried yesterday, and you want to play. You are evil children. Sit down and read a good book and think of your souls." He gave me a pious text to read, but I picked it up and threw it into the dog kennel. And I told him I hated a good book. Heathcliff kicked his book into the same place. Then what a fuss. "Master Hindley," cried Joseph, "look what those evil children have done." Heathcliff says that we should steal some food and go running on the moors and stay there all day. I like the idea. We cannot be damper or colder out there in the rain than we are here.
I suppose they did go, for the next sentence was on a new subject.
Hindley has made me cry so much that my head aches. Poor Heathcliff. Hindley calls him a vagabond and won't let him sit with us or eat with us any more. He says that I must not play with Heathcliff. If I do, he says he will throw Heathcliff out of the house. He blames our father, how dare he, for treating Heathcliff too liberally. Hindley swears that he will reduce Heathcliff to his right place.
I began to feel sleepy once more, and my eye wandered from manuscript to print. At the top of the page it said, 70 times 7 and the first of the 71st. A pious discourse by the Reverend Jabez Branderham. I must have fallen asleep then. What can explain the terrible dream I had? It must have been the result of poor digestion or bad temper. I dreamt that it was morning, and I was going home through the snow with Joseph as my guide. He kept telling me that I should have brought a pilgrim's staff, that I would never get into the house without one. He waved his thick walking stick at me proudly, and so I understood that was what he meant by pilgrim's staff. At first I thought it absurd that I should need such a weapon to get into my own house, but then I realized that we were going to hear the famous Jabez Branderham preach a sermon on the 70 times 7. We came to the chapel. I have passed it really in my walks. It is a damp, gloomy, dilapidated place. However, in my dream, Jabez preached, good God, what a sermon! It was divided into 490 parts, each as long as a normal sermon, and each discussing a different sin. Some of these were sins I had never thought about before. In my dream I was terribly tired and bored by the sermon. Finally, I rose to my feet and accused Jabez of the sin that no Christian need pardon, the sin of boring us all to death. But Jabez turned to me and accused me of the first of the 71st. He called upon his congregation to execute the Lord's judgment upon me. With that, the entire congregation attacked me with their pilgrim staffs. I tried to take Joseph's staff from him so I could defend myself, but the old man was too strong for me. At that point, much to my relief, I woke up. The branch of a tree was tapping against the window in the wind. I went back to sleep and dreamt even more disagreeably than before, if that is possible. I dreamt I was awake in the oak case. I could hear the wind outside and the tapping of the branch. The tapping annoyed me so much that I decided to stop it. I tried to open the window, but could not. I broke the glass with my fist and stretched my hand out to break off the branch, but instead my fingers closed around a little ice-cold hand. The intense horror of nightmare overcame me. I tried to withdraw my arm, but the little hand clung to me, and a most melancholy voice sobbed,
Oh, let me in! Let me in!
"Who are you?" I asked, still struggling to free myself.
Catherine Linton!
Replied the voice. Why did I think of Linton? I had read Earnshaw 20 times for every Linton.
I have come home. I was lost on the moor.
In the darkness, I could see a child's face looking through the window. Terror made me cruel, and since I could not free my arm from its grip, I pulled its wrist onto the broken glass of the window and rubbed it back and forth until blood ran down and soaked the bedclothes. Still it cried,
Let me in!
and maintained its grip. How can I? Let me go if you want me to let you in. The fingers relaxed. I snatched my hand back through the hole, piled the books up in front of it, and stopped my ears so that I would not hear those dreadful cries. "Go away!" I shouted. "I will not let you in. Not if you beg for 20 years.
It is 20 years.
Cried the voice.
I've been a lost child for 20 years.
Then I heard a faint scratching outside, and the pile of books moved forwards, as though pushed from behind. I screamed aloud, "Oh!" Unfortunately, the scream was real. Someone ran into my bedroom. I saw his light flickering, but he could not see me.
Is anyone here?
He whispered. I recognized Heathcliff's voice and thought it best to confess my presence at once, so I opened the door of the oak case to get out. The first creak of the door opening startled him like an electric shock. He dropped his candle and had difficulty picking it up again. "It is only your guest, sir," I said, wishing to spare him the humiliation of showing his cowardice further. "I had a terrible nightmare and screamed in my sleep. I'm sorry I disturbed you."
Oh, the devil take you, Mr. Lockwood!
Cried Heathcliff, putting his candle down on a chair because his hand was shaking.
Who put you in this room?
He asked, crushing his fingernails into his palms and grinding his teeth to stop the trembling.
Who was it? I'll throw them out of the house.
It was your servant, Zillah, I replied, and she deserves to be thrown out. She must have known that the place was haunted. It is swarming with ghosts.
Well, go back to bed, Mr. Lockwood. But don't scream again. Nothing could excuse that noise unless you were having your throat cut.
If the little devil had got in through the window, she probably would have strangled me.
Who do you mean?
Asked Heathcliff. Catherine Earnshaw, or Catherine Linton, or whatever her name was. She told me she had been walking on the moors for 20 years. The wicked little soul.
How dare you talk that way to me?
Thundered Heathcliff savagely.
God, he is mad to speak so.
And he struck his forehead with rage. At first I felt offended by this, but then I took pity on him. He seemed so powerfully affected, and told him more about my dream. Meanwhile, he sat in the oak case, so that I could no longer see his face, but I could tell from his breathing and the movement of his arm shadow on the wall that he was weeping.
Mr. Lockwood,
he said at last.
Go and wait for me in the corridor.
I went out of the room, but then stopped, for the corridor was dark. He thought I had gone, otherwise he never would have done what he did next. He broke the window open, bursting into tears as he did so.
Come in! Come in!
He sobbed.
Cathy, do come! Oh, do, once more! Oh, my heart's darling! Hear me this time, Catherine, at last!
The ghost, however, gave no sign. and the wind and the snow swirled in through the window and blew out the light.
Chapter 4.
The next morning, Heathcliff walked with me to the gate of Thrushcross Grange. From there, it was only 2 miles to the house, but I managed to get lost among the trees, and more than once I fell in the snow. When, finally, I reached the house, I was cold and wet. My housekeeper, Mrs. Dean, met me at the door and told me that dry clothes and a fire were awaiting me in my room. All that day I stayed in my room alone, and I confess I felt rather lonely, even though I had deliberately chosen the place for its solitude. When Mrs. Dean brought me my supper, I asked her to keep me company while I ate it. I sincerely hoped that she was a talkative woman. "How long have you lived at Thrushcross Grange, Mrs. Dean?"
18 years, sir. I came when the mistress married.
"And why does your master not live here? It is a far grander house than Wuthering Heights."
He does not like to spend money, sir. He's as rich as can be, but he never misses a chance to get richer still, even though he has no family to leave it to.
He told me he had a son.
His son is dead, sir. The young lady, Mrs. Heathcliff, is his widow.
Where did she come from originally? I asked.
Why, here, sir. She is my late master's daughter. Her maiden name was Catherine Linton. I took care of her when she was a baby, poor thing.
I started at the name, but the next moment I realised that she could not be my ghostly Catherine.
Yes, her father, Mr. Edgar Linton, lived here before you, sir. Heathcliff was married to Mr. Linton's sister. Then Cathy married her cousin, Heathcliff's son. Have you been to Wuthering Heights, sir?
Yes.
Oh, how is she, sir? How is Cathy, if you don't mind me asking?
She looked well and very handsome, though not happy, I think.
I am not surprised to hear it,
said Mrs. Dean.
And what did you think of the master?
He seems a rough fellow, Mrs. Dean. Am I right?
As rough as the edge of a saw, and as hard as stone. It's best to avoid him, sir.
Do you know anything of his history?
It's a cuckoo's history, sir,
said Mrs. Dean.
I know all about it, except where he was born, who were his parents, and how he got his money at first. Hareton has been cast out like the baby sparrow. Everyone except Hareton himself knows how he has been cheated.
Well, Mrs. Dean, it is a most intriguing story. Will you sit with me for an hour and tell me all about it?
Certainly, sir. Just let me get my sewing. And I'll bring you some hot soup, sir. I think you have caught a chill.
It was true. My head felt very hot, and the rest of me felt cold. A few minutes later, she returned with her sewing and a steaming bowl of soup. She gave me the soup, then sat down to begin her sewing and her story.
Before I came to live here,
she said,
I was almost always at Wuthering Heights. My mother had nursed Mr. Hindley Earnshaw, that's Hareton's father, and I had got used to playing with the children, Hindley and Cathy. One fine summer morning, Mr. Earnshaw, the old master, went off to Liverpool on business. After 3 days he returned late in the evening, carrying something bundled up in his coat. Hindley and Cathy thought he had brought them presents, but when he opened the coat, we saw a dirty, ragged, black-haired child. The child was old enough to walk and talk, but when he spoke it was in some strange language that no one could understand. Mr. Earnshaw said to his wife,
"We must take him as a gift from God, my dear, although he's dark enough to have come from the devil."
Mrs. Earnshaw was furious. She wanted to throw the gypsy child, as she called him, out into the street. She asked her husband if he had gone mad. Mr. Earnshaw explained that he had found the child starving and homeless in the streets of Liverpool, and had decided to take him home and care for him. Hindley and Cathy then asked about their presents, but they found that Hindley's present had been broken, and Cathy's had been lost on the journey home. Hindley, who was 14, burst into tears. Cathy spat at the gypsy child because she had decided it was all his fault. But her father slapped her and told her she should have better manners. Mr. Earnshaw said that the gypsy child should sleep with the children, but Cathy and Hindley refused to sleep with him, so I left him on the stairs, hoping he would be gone by morning. In the morning, Mr. Earnshaw found him sleeping on the floor outside his bedroom door. They called him Heathcliff. It was the name of a son who had died in childhood, and he has used it ever since, both for Christian name and for surname. A short time after Heathcliff arrived, Mrs. Earnshaw fell ill and died. Mr. Earnshaw was left alone with the 3 children. Heathcliff and Miss Cathy became great friends, but Hindley hated him, and so did I. Hindley hit him, and I pinched him, but he never cried. Perhaps he was used to harsh treatment. Later, when I knew him better, I stopped hating Heathcliff, and so Hindley lost his only ally. Whenever Mr. Earnshaw found out that Hindley had been cruel to Heathcliff, he got very angry. He was very fond of Heathcliff, and believed everything the boy said. To be fair, he did not say much, and it was usually the truth. Heathcliff was clearly Mr. Earnshaw's favourite. So, from the very beginning, Heathcliff brought bad feeling into the house. Heathcliff knew the power he had over Mr. Earnshaw. By the time Mr. Earnshaw died, 2 years later, Hindley thought of his father as an oppressor, and of Heathcliff as the usurper of his father's affection. He grew bitter thinking about these injuries. For example, I remember once Mr. Earnshaw bought 2 colts, one for each of the boys. Heathcliff took the handsomer colt, but soon it became lame. When Heathcliff discovered this, he said to Hindley,
You must exchange horses with me. If you refuse, I will tell your father of the 3 beatings you gave me this week. I will show him my arm, which is black to the shoulder.
Hindley put out his tongue and hit Heathcliff.
Go away, you dog!
Cried Hindley. He picked up an iron weight used to weigh potatoes and threatened to throw it at Heathcliff.
Go on, throw it!
Said Heathcliff.
And then I will tell him that you said you will throw me out of the house as soon as he dies. He will throw you out.
Hindley threw the weight and hit Heathcliff on the chest. Heathcliff fell down but then got up immediately, breathless and pale. Had I not prevented it, he would have gone to Mr. Earnshaw and shown him the mark on his chest.
Take my colt then, gypsy!
Cried Hindley.
And I pray that you fall off it and break your neck! Be damned, you beggarly interloper! You tried to trick my father out of all he has, but I'll show him what you are, you devil!
I had no trouble persuading Heathcliff to lay the blame of his bruises on the horse, so that Mr. Earnshaw would not be angry with Hindley. Indeed, he complained so seldom of Hindley's treatment that I really thought he was not vindictive. But I was completely wrong, as you will hear. Chapter 8. Edgar had left by the time Hindley came in, drunk and swearing at the top of his voice. I put Hareton in the kitchen cupboard to keep him safe from his father. The poor little thing remained perfectly quiet wherever I chose to put him.
Where's my son?
Shouted Hindley, grabbing me by the back of the neck, as if I were a dog.
I'll kill you, Nelly, if you don't tell me where he is. I'll stick this carving knife down your throat.
I don't like the carving knife, Mr. Hindley, said I. I have been cutting fish with it, and it smells. I'd prefer to be shot, please.
You prefer to be damned. Open your mouth.
He pushed the point of the knife between my teeth. I spat it out and said it tasted awful. Just then I saw Hareton standing at the door crying pitifully. Hindley saw him too, dropped the knife and grabbed the child, who only cried all the louder.
What's wrong with him? Doesn't he love his father? What an unnatural child!
Cried Hindley, But the child kept screaming. Hindley ran upstairs and held little Hareton over the banister.
Be quiet and kiss your father, or I'll drop you,
cried Hindley. I rushed up to save the child, but as I reached the top, I saw Hindley bend forward over the banister.
Who is that coming in?
He asked vaguely, and Hareton wriggled out of his grasp and fell. There was hardly time to feel a thrill of horror when we saw that the child was safe. Heathcliff, whose step we had heard, arrived below and instinctively caught the child in his arms. But when he looked up and saw that it was Hindley who had let Hareton drop, his face showed clearly that he regretted having caught the child. His vengeful heart would have enjoyed watching the drunken father weep for the son he had accidentally killed. Hindley came downstairs and poured himself a glass of brandy. "Oh, sir, you've had more than enough already," I cried, trying to take the glass from his hand. "Have mercy on this unfortunate child if you have none on your own soul." He raised the glass out of my reach and made a toast.
"Here's to my own soul's damnation,"
cried the blasphemer.
"Now, get out of my sight, all of you."
I went to the kitchen to comfort little Hareton. Heathcliff walked through the kitchen. I thought he had gone out to the stables to feed the horses, but later I discovered that he had lain down on a bench by the wall, far away from the light of the fire, and remained silent. I rocked Hareton in my arms and sang a song to him that began, "It was late at night and the babies cried, and their mother heard them in her grave." Then Miss Cathy, who had heard all the trouble from her room, came in and whispered,
"Are you alone, Nelly?"
"Yes, miss," I replied. She came and sat beside me, and I saw a tear roll down her cheek. For a moment I thought she had come to say she was sorry for having treated me so badly. But no, she was upset about her own concerns, as usual.
"I'm so unhappy,"
she said. "What a pity," said I. "You have everything in the world, and yet you can't be happy."
"Today, Edgar Linton asked me to marry him, Nelly, and I gave him an answer. Before I tell you what my answer was, I want you to tell me what it should have been."
"Really, Miss Cathy, I don't know. If he asked you after your dreadful behaviour, you probably should have refused him because he must be a fool."
"I accepted him, Nelly. Be quick. Say whether I was right or wrong."
I put Miss Cathy through a sort of catechism. "Do you love him?" I asked.
"Yes, I do."
"Why do you love him?"
"Because he is handsome and pleasant."
"Bad," said I.
"And he loves me."
"That's a little better, but not much."
"And he will be rich, and I would love to be rich."
"Worst of all! Now tell me why you are unhappy. Your brother will be pleased that you are to marry Mr. Linton, and his parents will not object. You will escape from a disorderly, comfortless home to a wealthy, respectable one. You love Edgar, and he loves you. All seems smooth and easy. Where is the obstacle?"
"Here and here,"
cried Catherine, striking her forehead and then her breast.
"wherever the soul lives. In my soul, in my heart, I am convinced that I am wrong."
"I don't understand you," said I. She was silent for a while, then she said,
"Nelly, do you ever have strange dreams?"
"Sometimes."
"So do I. I've dreamt dreams that have stayed with me ever after and changed my ideas. They've gone through me like wine through water and changed the colour of my mind. And this is one. I'm going to tell it, but you must not smile at any part of it."
"Very well," said I.
"I dreamt I was in heaven, Nelly, but I was extremely miserable. Heaven did not seem to be my home, and I wept and wept until the angels became angry and threw me out, and I landed in the middle of the moors at Wuthering Heights, and I woke up sobbing for joy. That will explain my secret. I should not marry Edgar Linton any more than I should live in heaven. And if Hindley had not brought Heathcliff so low, I would never have thought of it. It would degrade me to marry Heathcliff now, so he shall never know how I love him.
I noticed a movement in the shadows and saw that Heathcliff had been there, listening all the time. He crept out silently. Cathy did not notice anything. She went on,
I don't love Heathcliff because he's handsome. I love him because he's more myself than I am. Whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same, and Linton's is as different as moonbeam from lightning or frost from fire. My great miseries in this world have been Heathcliff's miseries. If all else perished and he remained, I would go on living. But if he perished, the universe would seem a great stranger to me, and I would not seem to be a part of it. My love for Linton is like the leaves on the trees. Time will change it, I know. My love for Heathcliff is like the eternal rocks beneath, a source of little visual delight, but necessary. Nelly, I am Heathcliff. He is always in my mind, not as a pleasure any more than I am always a pleasure to myself, but as my own being.
But think, Miss Cathy, if Heathcliff loves you as you say you love him, how terrible it will be for him to lose you.
Lose me? Why should he lose me? We shall be together as we always have been. But you see, Nelly, if I married Heathcliff, we would have no money. If I marry Edgar, I can help Heathcliff to rise and place him out of my brother's power.
Well, Miss Cathy, that is the worst reason you have given so far for marrying Edgar Linton. I can't understand your nonsense, miss, and I must make the dinner, so tell me no more secrets, please. When dinner was ready, I went to look for Heathcliff, but I could not find him. By this time there was a great thunderstorm, and wind and rain were lashing the moors. I told Cathy that Heathcliff had heard part of what she had said to me, and now he was nowhere to be found. She cried out as if in pain, and ran to find him herself. She ran to the top of the hill and called out his name. Then she sent Joseph out to search for him on the moor, and I went to look for him in the barn, but none of us found him. We did not see Heathcliff again that night, or for years to come.
At this point, Mrs. Dean looked at the clock.
My goodness, Mr. Lockwood, it's midnight. I must be off and let you sleep.
And indeed I did want to sleep. I felt weak and ill, with aching head and limbs.
Chapter 13.
Another week has passed, and I am nearly well again. I have now heard all my neighbour's story, and will write the rest down here in Mrs. Dean's words.
The following Sunday, when my master was at church, I brought Heathcliff's letter to my mistress. All the windows and doors of the house were open to let in the mild spring air, and she was sitting by her bedroom window, wearing a loose white dress. "There is a letter for you, madam," I said, and I placed it in her hand. She did not look at it or respond at all. After a while I said, "It needs an answer. It is from Mr. Heathcliff." She started and looked at the letter with hungry, eager eyes, but clearly she did not understand what it said. "He asks if he may come and see you," I said. She sighed and leaned back in her chair, but did not respond. It was clear to me that my poor mistress would never be well again. Just then I heard Heathcliff's step on the stairs. The open house had been too much of a temptation for him. She heard it too, and stared at the door with glittering eyes. Then he was by her side and had grasped her in his arms. He did not speak or let go of her for 5 minutes. He just held her tightly and kissed her over and over again. His face was buried in her hair, and it struck me that he probably could not bear to look at her face, so clear were the signs there that she was sure to die.
Oh, Cathy! Oh, my life! How can I bear it?
He cried in despair.
What now?
Said Catherine, leaning back to look at his face.
You and Edgar have broken my heart, Heathcliff, and you both come to me and cry as if you were the people to be pitied. I shall not pity you. You have killed me, and it has done you good. How strong you are! How many years do you plan to live after I am dead?
Heathcliff had knelt on one knee to embrace her. Now he tried to rise, but she grabbed his hair and kept him down.
I wish I could hold you until we were both dead,
she said bitterly.
Will you forget me and be happy when I am in the earth? Will you say, that is the grave of Catherine Earnshaw? I loved her long ago, but I have loved others since, and I love my children more than I ever loved her. Will you say so, Heathcliff?
Don't torture me till I'm as mad as you are!
Cried Heathcliff, tearing his head free from her grasp so violently that some of his hair was left in her hand.
You must be possessed by a devil to talk to me that way when you are dying. Don't you realise that every word will be burnt into my memory? I will think about these words of yours again and again, forever after you are gone.
He left her side and walked over to the fireplace. There he stood with his back to her, so that she could not see his face.
Heathcliff, don't be angry now,
said Catherine, rising from her chair.
Do come to me, Heathcliff.
He turned to her, his eyes wet with tears. Then Catherine leapt towards him, and they were locked in an embrace from which I thought my mistress would never be released alive. It seemed to me that she had fainted in his arms, and I went closer to see if she was all right. Heathcliff glared at me, breathing heavily like a mad dog. He did not seem like one of my own species. Then Catherine put her arm around his neck and her cheek against his.
Why did you betray your own heart, Cathy?
He cried.
You loved me. What right had you to leave me? You say I have killed you, but you killed yourself. You say I broke your heart, but you broke your own heart by marrying Linton, and you broke mine too. Do you think I want to live? I wish I were not strong and healthy. What kind of life will it be when you... Oh, God! Would you like to live with your soul in the grave?
Just then I saw the servants and my master returning from church. You must go, Mr. Heathcliff, I cried. He will be here in a minute.
Catherine, I must go,
said Heathcliff, trying to extricate himself from her embrace.
No, you must not go,
she replied, holding him tightly.
Don't go. This is the last time. I shall die.
Heathcliff sat down again and stroked her hair, whispering,
Hush, my darling. I'll stay. Don't worry.
But she was limp in his arms, and her eyes were shut. I thought she had either fainted or died. It would be better, I thought, if she had died. I heard my master coming up the stairs. There was cold sweat on my forehead. I was horrified. When he saw Heathcliff, Edgar went white with rage, but Heathcliff stood and said,
Take care of her first. You can talk to me later.
And he left the house. At midnight, that night the Catherine you saw at Wuthering Heights was born. 2 hours later, her mother died. Linton's grief was too painful to describe. I believe it was made even worse by the fact that he had no heir. Old Mr. Linton had left Thrushcross Grange to his own daughter, Isabella, if Edgar should have no sons. Now Edgar's daughter would be left with nothing. As the sun rose, my master lay on Catherine's pillow, exhausted by grief, his living face as pale as the dead face beside him. I went outside into the park, where I was sure I would find Heathcliff waiting. I found him standing under a tree. He must have been standing still for a very long time, because 2 birds were hopping on the ground beside him, as if he were a piece of wood. When I approached, they flew away.
I know she's dead,
said Heathcliff.
How did she die, Nelly?
Very peacefully. She did not speak again after you left. She died very early this morning. She looks so peaceful now. Let's hope she may wake to peace in the other world.
May she wake in torment!
Cried Heathcliff with sudden passion.
Catherine Earnshaw, may you not rest as long as I am living. You said I killed you. Haunt me then. The murdered do haunt their murderers, I believe. Be with me always. Take any form. Drive me mad. Just don't leave me here alone without you. Oh God, I cannot live without my life. I cannot live without my soul.
He dashed his head against the tree trunk until his forehead was stained with blood. He howled and sobbed. Not like a man, but like a savage beast in torment. Chapter 15. The 12 years that followed that dismal period were the happiest in my life. I took care of young Catherine and watched her grow. She was such a little beauty that she seemed to bring sunshine into the house. Her eyes were dark like her mother's, but her skin was pale, and her hair was yellow and curling like the Lintons. She was lively but not rough, a very affectionate child, as her mother had been, but not really like her mother. Young Catherine could be soft and mild as a dove. She had a gentle voice and a pensive expression. Her anger was never furious, her love never fierce. For the first 12 years of her life, she lived at Thrushcross Grange, hardly ever leaving the grounds. She knew nothing of Heathcliff and Wuthering Heights. Sometimes she looked at the hills beyond the park and asked me what they were like and whether I had been there. She wanted very much to go beyond the gates of the park and wander on those hills with her little horse. However, her father did not want her to know about Heathcliff and Wuthering Heights. He told her she could go when she was older. That year, Isabella fell ill. She wrote to Edgar and asked him to come to her. She said that she was going to die and she wished to arrange everything for her son, Linton. She asked Edgar to take her son to live with us at Thrushcross Grange after she was dead. Edgar went to see her as soon as he received this letter. He told me to take good care of Catherine while he was gone and to make sure she did not leave the grounds of Thrushcross Grange. He was gone for 3 weeks. At first, Catherine played in the house, but then she got bored and asked if she could ride around the park on her pony. I let her go, and for several days she enjoyed herself wandering around the extensive grounds of Thrushcross Grange. One day, however, she was not back by tea-time. I sent the servants to look for her, but she was nowhere to be found. In panic, I went to look for her myself. Clearly she had left the park. I remembered her questions about the hills and felt sure she had gone there, so I walked out of the park across the moor and up the hill as quickly as I could. When I came to Wuthering Heights, I saw a woman in the yard. She was the housekeeper. "Hello," she said. "Are you looking for the little girl? Don't worry, she's safe in our sitting room." "Is she with Mr. Heathcliff?" I asked. "Oh, no," said she. "Mr. Heathcliff and Joseph are away. They won't be back until late. Come in." I followed her into the sitting room, and there by the fire was Catherine, sitting in her mother's old chair, talking to Hareton. They looked up when I came in, and I noticed that they both had the first Catherine's dark eyes. "Come on, Miss Cathy. We're going home," I said.
"Oh, not yet, Nelly. I want to stay here a little longer,"
replied Cathy. "If you knew whose house this was, you would be glad to leave," I said.
"It's your father's house, isn't it?"
said Cathy, turning to Hareton. He blushed red and did not reply.
"Or is it your master's house? I see now. You are a servant. Well then, you should get my horse and I will go home. You should have told me you were a servant."
Damn you! I'm not a servant!
cried Hareton furiously.
"What? Nelly, did you hear what he said to me? How dare he?
Well, miss, said the housekeeper, you shouldn't tell him what to do. He is not a servant. He's your cousin.
My cousin?
Exclaimed Cathy, staring at his long hair and dirty clothes.
He can't be. My father has gone to get my cousin and bring him home to live with us.
You have more than one cousin, I said, hurrying her out of the house. On the way home, I explained to her about Wuthering Heights. I told her that her father did not want her to know about it, and if he discovered that she had been there, he would be very angry with me. Cathy promised to say nothing to her father on the subject. After all, she was a sweet little girl. The next day, we received a letter saying that my master was coming home. Isabella was dead, and Edgar was bringing her son Linton home to live with us. Catherine was very excited. When the carriage arrived, she ran to meet it, eager to see her cousin. But her father stopped her and said,
Now, Cathy, you must be very gentle and patient with Linton. He's not well, and he's very sad because his mother has just died. He won't be able to play with you yet.
Linton was carried into the house. He looked very much like Edgar, the same fair curly hair, slim figure, delicate features, and pale skin. But his expression was sickly and peevish, not at all like the open, honest, affectionate expression of Edgar's face. At first, Cathy sat by him, still and silent, but then she began to stroke his hair and kiss his cheek. He seemed to like this treatment and smiled at her weakly. That night, when the children were asleep, Joseph came to speak to my master.
Heathcliff has sent me to get his son,
said Joseph. Edgar was silent for a minute. He wanted to obey Isabella's last wish and keep the boy at Thrushcross Grange, but Heathcliff was the boy's father.
Tell Mr. Heathcliff that his son shall come to Wuthering Heights tomorrow,
said Edgar.
He is asleep in bed now. He is not in good health. And tell him that the boy's mother wished him to live here with me.
Heathcliff doesn't care about what the mother wished,
said Joseph.
He wants the boy, and he wants him now.
Not tonight,
said Edgar. He took the old man by the arm and led him to the door. As the door closed behind him, Joseph cried out,
Heathcliff will come himself tomorrow. You won't dare to throw him out.
Early the next morning, my master told me to take the boy to Wuthering Heights. Cathy was still in bed when we left. On the way, Linton asked me many questions about his father.
Why did my mother never tell me about him? Why did he not live with us, as other fathers do? Why did he never come to see us?
I answered these questions as briefly as possible, trying to calm the boy. When we got to Wuthering Heights, Heathcliff, Joseph and Hareton came out to greet us. They all stared at Linton with curiosity.
Good Lord,
said Heathcliff.
Look at him. He is certainly his mother's son. There's none of me in him. Look how pale and thin and sickly he is. But never mind, he is mine, and he is the heir of Thrushcross Grange. It will give me great satisfaction to see my son the master of that house. You need not worry about him, Nelly. I will take good care of him. I wouldn't want him to die before he is master of Thrushcross Grange. I have hired a tutor for him, and I have told Hareton to obey him. I will raise him as a fine gentleman. It is a pity that he is such a weak, miserable creature, but he will be master even so.
As I rode back alone to Thrushcross Grange, I felt sorry for the boy. But at least, I thought, Heathcliff's selfishness will make him treat the boy well. Chapter 18.
1802. In the second week of January, I was feeling stronger, so I rode over to Wuthering Heights to tell my landlord that I would leave Thrushcross Grange. Hareton Earnshaw let me in. I took more notice of him this time. He was a handsome lad, but his manner was very rough. I asked if Mr. Heathcliff were at home. He told me that Heathcliff was out, but would return for dinner. I said that I would wait for him. Catherine was in the sitting room, preparing some vegetables for dinner. She seemed sadder and less spirited than before. She did not greet me, but went on with her task as if I were not there. When Heathcliff arrived, I noticed that he was thinner and had a restless, anxious expression. "I am going to London, Mr. Heathcliff," said I, "and I will not return to Thrushcross Grange. You can find another tenant for October,"
Oh, indeed.
said he.
But you must pay your rent till October, sir, as we agreed.
"Of course," I replied, irritated by his manner. "I'll pay you now if you like." Riding away from Wuthering Heights, I thought what a strange, romantic fairy tale it would have been if Mrs. Linton Heathcliff and I had fallen in love, and I had taken her away with me from this lonely place to the lively atmosphere of London. The following September, as I was going to visit a friend in the north, I realized that my journey took me close to Thrushcross Grange. I had a sudden impulse to spend the night there. After all, I had paid the rent. It was mine until October. I stopped the carriage in the village and told my driver to sleep at the inn and be ready to drive on in the morning. Then I walked to the Grange. When I got there, however, I found a strange woman in the kitchen. I told her who I was and asked her to prepare a room for me. Then I asked her where Mrs. Dean was.
"She lives up at Wuthering Heights now,"
said the woman. I decided to go to Wuthering Heights to see Mrs. Dean. The sun was setting and the moon was rising as I left the park. When I reached Wuthering Heights, I noticed that the doors and windows were open, and there were flowers in the garden. That is an improvement, I thought. As I approached the door, I heard voices from within.
No, no, no.
Said a voice, as sweet as a silver bell.
Read it again, and this time with no mistakes.
Kiss me first.
Said a deeper voice.
Not until you have read it perfectly.
I looked in and saw Catherine and Hareton sitting by the window, with their heads bent close together over a book. Hareton was handsome, clean, and well-dressed, and his face glowed with pleasure. Her face was full of gentle, tender affection. Seeing it, I felt sad at the thought of what I had missed. When Hareton had read the passage through with no mistakes, Catherine kissed him and said,
Let's go for our walk now.
I did not want to interrupt them, so I hid behind the door until they were gone. When they were out of the gate, I looked into the sitting room again and saw my old friend, Nellie Dean, sitting by the fire, sewing. She saw me and leapt to her feet.
"Mr. Lockwood, why didn't you tell us you were coming? Thrushcross Grange will not be ready for you."
Don't worry, said I. I have been to Thrushcross Grange, and the housekeeper is preparing a room for me now. But tell me, why aren't you at Thrushcross Grange, Mrs. Dean?
"Oh, I've been here for over 3 months now. I came just before Mr. Heathcliff died,"
she replied. Is Heathcliff dead, then? I asked, amazed.
"Yes, didn't you know? But come in and I'll tell you all about it."
I entered and sat by the fire, opposite Mrs. Dean, and she told me the end of Heathcliff's story. I will retell it here, in her own words.
"I was summoned to Wuthering Heights a few months after you left us. Mr. Heathcliff said he was tired of seeing Catherine. I should make the kitchen my sitting room, he said, and keep Catherine with me there. I did as I was told, and Hareton spent his evenings with us in the kitchen. I noticed that the young people were fond of each other now. Catherine told me how they had become friends. After Linton Heathcliff's death, Catherine had spent most of her time in her room, but there was no fire there. and one day she told Zilla that she couldn't stand the cold any more. Zilla told her to come downstairs to the sitting room. Since Mr. Heathcliff was out, she came down and sat by the fire with Zilla and Hareton. After that, she came downstairs every time Mr. Heathcliff was out. At first, she was haughty and proud towards Hareton, but gradually they made friends. Instead of laughing at his ignorance as she had done before, Catherine began to teach him to read. Although she still teased him about being stupid, it was now clear that she was only joking. She liked him and wanted to help him. One day, a short time after I arrived at the Heights, Catherine asked Hareton to clear some land so that she could plant flowers. He did so with pleasure, and they spent a fine afternoon planting the flowers and admiring their work. That evening at dinner, Joseph complained that they had taken a part of his fruit and vegetable garden.
He pulled out 3 fruit trees to plant those flowers.
Joseph complained.
Did he indeed?
Cried Mr. Heathcliff.
Well, tomorrow he will pull up the flowers and plant the fruit trees again.
No, he won't.
Cried Catherine.
You have taken all my land, and all Hareton's land too. We are entitled to a bit of land to plant flowers in if we want. You see, Hareton and I are friends now. He will not do what you tell him to do now, if I don't want him to.
Hush!
Said Hareton, afraid of making Heathcliff angry.
Get out of my sight, you little witch!
Cried Heathcliff. Catherine left the room quickly, and Hareton and I followed her. A moment later we heard the front door slam. Heathcliff had gone out, so we could all relax a little. Catherine and Hareton started reading together, as they usually did in the evenings. I sat sewing by the fire. An hour later, Heathcliff returned. When he walked into the room, Catherine and Hareton looked up from their book. I don't know if you have noticed, but their eyes are exactly alike. They are the first Catherine's eyes. I suppose Mr. Heathcliff saw the resemblance as he looked at them. He told them to leave the room, but made a sign to me to stay behind.
Ah, Nellie,
He said when they were gone.
what a ridiculous end to all my efforts. I have spent my life trying to destroy 2 families. Now that everything is mine, I find I no longer want to punish them. My old enemies have not beaten me. Now I could destroy their offspring completely. But what's the use? I no longer want to give them pain. It is not that I have decided to be generous to them. It's simply that I no longer enjoy tormenting them. Hareton reminds me of myself at his age, and he also looks like Catherine, my Catherine. But I don't need Hareton to remind me of her. I think about her all the time. I see her face in every cloud, in every tree. The whole world is a reminder that she existed, and I lost her.
A few weeks after that, Heathcliff was away from home all night. The next morning, Catherine went out to pick some flowers. When she came back, she said she had seen Heathcliff and that he looked happy. This was strange news indeed. I waited for him anxiously, curious to see what he looked like when he was happy. Finally, he came home. He was pale and trembling, but there was a strange, joyful glitter in his eyes. I asked him where he had been all night, but he did not answer me. I offered him food, but he did not eat. He sat by the window, looking out eagerly, that strange smile on his face. Later I brought him coffee, but he did not touch it. He sat there, looking at the wall with intense interest. "Come, master," I said, "drink your coffee before it gets cold."
Be quiet.
He cried.
Turn round and tell me, are we alone in this room?
"Of course we are alone, Mr. Heathcliff," I replied.
Look.
He whispered. I turned and looked. Now it seemed to me that he was not looking at the wall, but rather at something 2 yards in front of him. Something that seemed to cause him great pleasure and great pain. But there was nothing there. The object he stared at seemed to move, for his gaze moved with it. "Come, Mr. Heathcliff, eat some bread at least. You have eaten nothing for days." But he did not answer me. He stood up and walked out of the house and disappeared through the gate. He did not return until after midnight. Then he went straight to Catherine's old bedroom, the one with the oak case, and locked himself in. I went quietly to the door and listened. I could hear his voice, speaking as if to a living person. From time to time, I heard him speak Catherine's name with some endearment or expression of suffering. That night the wind blew and the rain beat down on the house. I slept badly and had frightening dreams. The next morning I went outside to get a little fresh air. I noticed that the window of the first Catherine's old bedroom was wide open. I went into the house and upstairs to the room. When I opened the door of the oak case, I found Mr. Heathcliff lying on the bed. His eyes were wide open and had a strange, joyful expression, and his face was washed with rain. One hand lay on the window-sill. The window had been knocking against it, but it was not bleeding. When I touched it, I found that it was stone cold. There could be no doubt that he was dead. We buried him as he had wished, beside Catherine in the old graveyard on the moor. Hareton and I were the only mourners, and no prayers were spoken over his grave. I hope he is at peace now, although some of the village people say they have seen his ghost walking on the moors. One stormy evening, when I was walking to the grange, I met a little shepherd boy with a sheep and 2 lambs. He was weeping. I asked him what was the matter, and he told me that he had seen the ghosts of Heathcliff and a woman up on the moor.
Just then the gate opened, and Catherine and Hareton returned. I could hear their happy voices just outside the door. Once again, I felt the desire to escape them. "Goodbye, Mrs. Dean," I said, pressing some money into her hand, and I slipped out through the kitchen door. On my way back to the Grange, I passed by the lonely churchyard where Heathcliff, Catherine, and Edgar were buried. It was a calm, beautiful, moonlit night. The breeze was warm and gentle. As I stood there, breathing in the sweet smell of late summer flowers, I wondered how anyone could ever imagine unquiet slumbers for the sleepers in that quiet earth.